Have you ever noticed something quietly peculiar about the way some people watch television? They don't chase the newest series everyone is talking about. They don't rush to finish trending shows or constantly search for something fresh. Instead, they return to the same story, again and again. The same characters, the same episodes, the same scenes they already know by heart. They know which joke is coming next. They know exactly when the music will swell, when the argument will happen, when the moment of relief will arrive. And yet, they watch it anyway. Sometimes for the 5th time. Sometimes for the 10th. Maybe you've done this yourself. Maybe there's a show you return to on quiet evenings when the world feels heavy. A familiar episode you play while eating dinner. A series that feels less like entertainment and more like a place you visit. From the outside, this habit seems strange. Why rewatch something when you already know the ending? But the psychology behind this behavior reveals something surprisingly deep about how the human mind seeks safety, memory, and emotional stability in an unpredictable world. Because for many people, rewatching the same shows isn't about boredom. It's about comfort. Here's the paradox most people overlook. In a world that constantly pushes us toward novelty, some minds crave familiarity. Psychologically, humans are wired to seek both exploration and safety. New experiences stimulate curiosity and growth, but familiarity soothes the nervous system. When you watch a new show, your brain stays alert. You don't know what will happen next. You're anticipating twists, surprises, emotional turns. But when you rewatch a familiar story, something different happens. Your brain relaxes. The uncertainty disappears. There's no tension about whether the characters will be okay. No anxiety about unexpected endings. You already know. And that knowledge creates a subtle sense of control. In psychology, this is closely connected to something called predictive processing. The brain constantly tries to predict the future to reduce stress. When life feels chaotic, unpredictable, or overwhelming, familiar patterns become incredibly soothing. And what is a TV show if not a pattern? A sequence of moments you've already survived emotionally. So when someone rewatches the same series repeatedly, they aren't avoiding novelty. They're returning to a psychological environment where nothing can hurt them unexpectedly. The story becomes a controlled emotional space. Think about the last time life felt overwhelming. Maybe work was stressful. Maybe relationships felt complicated. Maybe the future felt uncertain in ways you couldn't quite explain. During those times, people often gravitate toward familiar things. Old songs, childhood movies, comfort foods, and yes, familiar shows. Because familiarity creates something psychologists call emotional regulation. When the brain knows exactly what emotional journey lies ahead, it can relax. You know the conflict will resolve. You know the characters will survive. You know the ending will arrive exactly the way it always does. And this predictability allows the mind to rest. For someone carrying hidden stress, rewatching a familiar show can feel like sitting down with an old friend. The dialogue is familiar. The environment feels safe. Nothing demands too much from you. You simply exist inside a story you already understand. This is why many people turn on the same show before sleeping. It becomes background comfort rather than stimulation. Their brain is saying quietly, "I've been here before. I know this place." But comfort is only part of the story. There's another psychological layer that explains why some shows feel impossible to leave behind. Memory. Certain shows become intertwined with specific periods of our lives. Maybe you first watched a series during university. Maybe it played during late nights with friends. Maybe it filled quiet evenings when you were figuring out who you were. Over time, the show becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a container for memory. When you rewatch it years later, your mind doesn't just see the story again. It reactivates the emotional atmosphere of that earlier version of yourself. The room you used to sit in. The person you used to be. The hopes you carried at the time. Psychologists call this nostalgic recall. And nostalgia is a powerful emotional experience. It reconnects us with continuity, with the sense that our life is a story unfolding through time. So when someone rewatches the same show repeatedly, they may not just be revisiting a fictional world. They may be revisiting themselves, the person they once were, the emotions they once felt, the version of life that existed when that story first entered their world. And in a fast-moving life, where everything keeps changing, returning to something familiar can feel like holding onto a piece of stability. But this behavior reveals something even more fascinating about human psychology. Because sometimes people don't just rewatch shows for comfort or nostalgia. Sometimes they do it because those fictional worlds understand them better than real ones. And that deeper reason begins to reveal itself when we look closer at the minds of people who prefer familiar stories over endless new ones. There's another reason some people return to the same shows again and again, and it's not something they always say out loud. Sometimes the characters feel more familiar than the world outside the screen. Think about it. In everyday life, people change. Relationships shift. Conversations can be unpredictable. Misunderstandings happen without warning. But in a show you've watched many times, the characters never change. They stay exactly as they were the first time you met them. Their personalities remain consistent. Their reactions are predictable. Their world follows rules you already understand. For someone who feels emotionally overwhelmed by real life, that stability can feel incredibly comforting. It's like visiting a small town where everyone already knows your name. You know how each character will react. You know who will comfort who will argue, who will make the joke that breaks the tension. This familiarity creates something psychologists sometimes refer to as parasocial comfort. A parasocial relationship is the feeling of connection we develop with fictional characters or public figures. Even though they don't know us, our minds still respond to them as if they were part of our emotional world. And when you've watched a show many times, those characters can start to feel strangely real. You know their personalities. You understand their struggles. You've witnessed their growth. They become a quiet presence in your life story. So when someone replays the same series over and over, they may not just be watching a show. They may be revisiting a world where the emotional rules feel clearer than the ones outside their door. There's also a personality pattern that often appears in people who rewatch familiar shows. They tend to be reflective. People who think deeply about life, relationships, and emotions often replay experiences in their minds. They revisit conversations. They analyze moments. They search for meaning beneath everyday interactions. Psychologists call this cognitive reflection. It's the tendency to process experiences slowly and thoughtfully rather than rushing past them. And the same mind that revisits real-life memories is often drawn to revisiting stories. Because every time you watch a show again, you notice something new. A line of dialogue you missed before. A subtle expression on a character's face. A deeper meaning hidden inside a scene. The story hasn't changed, but you have. Your perspective evolves. Your emotional understanding deepens. And suddenly, a moment that once seemed simple now carries a completely different meaning. This is why some people say they can watch the same show 5 or 10 times and still discover new things. The show becomes almost like a mirror. Each viewing reflects a slightly different version of the viewer. Interestingly, research has also found a link between rewatching familiar shows and anxiety. When people feel anxious or mentally overloaded, their brains often search for environments that feel predictable. Uncertainty is one of the brain's biggest stress triggers. When we don't know what will happen next, the nervous system stays alert. But familiar stories remove that uncertainty. You already know the outcome. Even if the characters face challenges, you know the resolution. This allows the brain to shift out of constant alert mode. Instead of scanning for threats or surprises, the mind settles into a calmer state. This is why people often rewatch shows during periods of stress, after a difficult day, during emotionally confusing times, or when life feels too complicated to process all at once. The familiar story acts almost like a psychological breathing space, a place where the mind can slow down. And sometimes, that temporary sense of control is exactly what someone needs to regain balance. Over time, this behavior can even turn into a ritual. Certain episodes become tied to specific moods. Some people replay a show while cleaning the house. Others play it quietly in the background while studying. Some return to the same episodes when they're sick, tired, or emotionally drained. The show becomes part of their personal rhythm, almost like a familiar soundtrack to life. Rituals, even small ones, are powerful psychological tools. They create structure in a world that often feels unpredictable. And the brain loves structure, because structure means safety. It means knowing what comes next. This is why many people return to the same stories during moments when life feels uncertain. The ritual itself becomes comforting. The opening theme song, the familiar dialogue, the scene you know is about to happen. Each moment tells the brain something simple but reassuring. You've survived this story before. But there is an even deeper layer behind this behavior, because sometimes people don't just rewatch shows for comfort, nostalgia, or anxiety relief. Sometimes they do it because those fictional worlds quietly represent something they feel is missing from real life. And that final psychological truth reveals something profound about the way humans search for belonging. There's a subtle emotional truth hidden inside the habit of rewatching the same shows. Sometimes the worlds we revisit on screen represent something we quietly long for in real life, a sense of belonging. Think about the kinds of shows people tend to rewatch the most. Stories about close friendships, small communities where everyone knows each other, groups of characters who argue, laugh, struggle, and still remain connected. In many ways, these shows portray a simplified version of human relationships. Conflicts happen, but they resolve. Misunderstandings occur, but they are explained. Characters hurt each other, but they return to the same table by the end of the episode. Real life rarely follows such neat emotional arcs. People drift apart without closure. Conversations end without explanation. Relationships fade quietly instead of resolving dramatically. But in familiar shows, the emotional rules remain stable. The characters return week after week. The group stays intact. The story continues. For someone who has experienced unpredictable relationships or emotional distance, this consistency can feel incredibly comforting. The show becomes a place where connection feels reliable, a place where belonging never disappears. And when someone presses play on that familiar episode again, they may be returning to more than just a story. They may be returning to the feeling of being part of something, even if only for a little while. Another reason this habit is becoming more common has to do with the world we live in today. Modern life moves quickly. People relocate for work. Friend groups change. Schedules become crowded with responsibilities. Many adults slowly discover that the kind of effortless social connection they once had becomes harder to maintain. Group chats grow quieter. Friends move away. Time becomes fragmented. And while people still interact constantly through screens and notifications, something deeper often goes missing. Unstructured time together. Long conversations without purpose. Shared moments that feel simple and genuine. In this environment, familiar stories sometimes fill emotional gaps. They provide the illusion of stability. The characters stay in the same city. They gather in the same cafe. They return to the same living room. Their world feels grounded in ways that real life sometimes doesn't. This doesn't mean people who rewatch shows are lonely, but it does suggest that familiar stories can offer something emotionally grounding when life becomes scattered. A reminder of connection. A reminder of continuity. People who rewatch the same shows often share another subtle trait. They tend to value emotional depth over novelty. For some personalities, the thrill of something new fades quickly. What they crave instead is understanding. They enjoy revisiting moments that carry emotional meaning, noticing details they missed before, reflecting on character decisions, understanding the motivations behind certain scenes. To them, the story becomes richer with each viewing, like rereading a meaningful book or listening to a song whose lyrics reveal something new every time. This reflects a psychological trait sometimes associated with introspective personalities. People who enjoy reflection often revisit experiences because they appreciate the layers hidden inside them. They're not just consuming entertainment, they're exploring meaning. And a familiar show gives them the perfect environment to do that. The emotional pressure is gone. The outcome is known, which means the mind can focus on understanding rather than anticipating. There is also something quietly therapeutic about revisiting stories that once comforted us, because every time we return to them, we bring a new version of ourselves, a person who has grown, learned, changed. The show remains the same. But we don't. The character whose choices once confused us suddenly makes sense. The moment that once felt trivial now carries emotional weight. The scene that once made us laugh now makes us pause and reflect. In this way, familiar stories become markers of personal growth. They allow us to witness how our own perspectives have evolved, and sometimes that realization brings a quiet sense of healing. You see the same characters again, but you understand them differently, which means you've changed, you've learned, you've grown, and that realization can feel surprisingly powerful. So, what does the psychology of rewatching the same shows really reveal? It reveals that human beings are not just seekers of novelty. We are seekers of emotional safety. We return to familiar places when life becomes uncertain. We revisit meaningful stories when we want to reconnect with ourselves. And sometimes the shows we replay are not simply entertainment. They are emotional anchors, small reminders of comfort, belonging, and memory in a world that moves too quickly. If you find yourself rewatching the same series again and again, it doesn't mean you lack curiosity. It may simply mean your mind understands something deeper. That peace is often found not in endless change, but in meaningful familiarity. That certain stories become part of our lives because they reflect something true about us. And that sometimes returning to the same place again and again isn't about refusing to move forward. It's about remembering who you were, understanding who you've become, and finding a quiet moment of stability in between. Because, in the end, the shows we return to the most are rarely just stories. They're emotional homes. Places where the mind can rest. Places where the heart recognizes something familiar. And in a constantly changing world, that familiarity can be one of the most comforting experiences we have.